You hearing this? Sergeant Lorne's voice came through the comm, jittery and low. A static crackle followed, then a high-pitched scream pierced the channel, so raw it sounded almost inhuman. Then silence. No warning, no explosion, just that one final sound etched into the system before everything cut off. Inside Command Module 17, half the crew froze mid-coffee, and the technician nearest to the console whispered, "That was supposed to be a status report." Everyone turned toward General Riker, who stood motionless, eyes locked on the screen like he was watching a ghost crawl out of it. Then he turned and muttered, "Dispatch recon. And send it armed." They'd called it Ice Ridge because it was the last stretch of high-altitude ice formations before the terrain dropped off into miles of glacier valleys and unscanned canyons. It was the edge of where humanity dared to dig in. Everything past it was off-grid, unclaimed, unpatrolled, and intentionally avoided. A dozen mining sites had once dotted the edge, but they'd all been shut down or mysteriously abandoned. The official records claimed it was cost inefficiency. The people stationed there had whispered about shadows in the blizzards and voices echoing through the steel walls. When the newest outpost was set up, the soldiers joked about snow ghosts to keep themselves sane. The jokes died fast. The frost came early this cycle, temperatures dropped faster than predicted, and the outpost energy grid had mysteriously overclocked 3 nights in a row. Then came the scream. 4 soldiers from Recon Squad 8 were loaded onto a small hover sled and deployed at dawn. They were good soldiers, gritty, efficient, not the panicky type. By 0800 hours, their cameras showed clear perimeter footage of the Ice Ridge outpost. No breaches, no damage, just the eerie stillness of a place abandoned without resistance. Their sensors picked up heat signatures, but they were faint and irregular. A single movement inside the comms cabin triggered a partial lockdown, but when they reached the doors, everything was already powered down. No signs of external force. One of the soldiers, Kendrick, radioed in. "We're inside. No bodies, but there's blood. A lot of it." He paused. "And there's something else." His voice dropped lower. "We found boots. 8 pairs. No people in them. Just boots. Still standing." That was the last time anyone heard Kendrick's voice. One camera captured a flash of movement across the hall, a blur that seemed to ripple through walls. Then static. Command didn't send another team. Not right away. Instead, they sent drones. High-altitude thermals, deep scans, the full satellite array. Nothing. No heat, no tech signature. The ridge was gone, and yet everything remained standing like a haunted shell. General Riker stood before the command screen, arms crossed, jaw clenched. A younger lieutenant tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Maybe it's just a wild bear, sir. Or a rogue frost ape. We've had those before." Riker didn't look at him. He simply replied, "Bears don't take boots. Apes don't shut down power grids. Something's hunting, and it's not dumb." Just before sunset, the silence broke. Not from the ridge, but from the outer perimeter near Sector C9. A figure was spotted emerging through the whiteout storm. Thermal scans glitched when focused on him, like his body heat was being scrambled by tech that didn't exist in Earth's catalog. He rode a creature, tall, 6-legged, with tusks of ice crystal and breath that steamed sideways in the blizzard. The man on its back wore a ragged, burn-scorched cloak that fluttered as he moved. His silhouette didn't match any profile in the military's registered personnel list. No facial recognition hit. He wasn't part of the original team. He wasn't on any survival logs. He didn't have gear. But he wasn't shivering either. He stopped near a half-buried observation tower, stared up at it like it had offended him, and muttered something into the snow that the drone's mic barely picked up. "They're early." Then he rode on. 2 soldiers on patrol tried to intercept, but by the time they approached the ridge he had disappeared again into the ravines beyond the camera's field. The animal he rode didn't leave tracks. Just steam that quickly froze. General Riker didn't speak much after that. But he ordered one thing. "Don't pursue him. Watch him. He stood at the holodeck long after the others cleared the command deck and stared at the figure's last recorded image. The camera had caught a brief glint beneath the cloak, an emblem, faded but visible. It was stitched into the fabric with a thread so dark it almost absorbed the light. It wasn't a unit patch. It wasn't modern. It was older. Much older. Riker narrowed his eyes and whispered, "That can't be him. He died years ago." The ice ridge, meanwhile, stood like a forgotten throne, untouched, eerily preserved, silent. The elite hunters hadn't arrived yet, but they would. Riker knew that. And whatever had come ahead of them, it wasn't friendly. Not to the hunters. Not to the humans. Not to anyone. The satellite picked up no more movement. The frozen silence deepened. But as night fell, faint marks began appearing across the ridge, spikes of bone driven into the ice, arranged in symbols no one had ever seen before, except in old, decommissioned war journals. One camera caught a final image before the lens cracked from sudden frost exposure, a spike planted near the outpost's door, with something hanging from it. It was a hunter's insignia, bent and smeared with blood. The wind howled louder that night, but inside the snowstorm, some claimed they could hear something stranger. A faint metallic dragging, like a chain across rock. And a voice, so low, so distorted, that it almost sounded like a whisper. The voice didn't call for help. It called for names. And somewhere deeper in the ridge, beneath an old maintenance shaft that hadn't been scanned in years, a fire flickered to life. Not from fuel. From memory. A man who should have been dead was carving names into a wall of ice. Not with a chisel. With a knife made from alien alloy, fused to the bone of his own hand. He had a list. And tonight it started. Ronak stood atop the glass ridge that overlooked the frozen valley, his breath clouding the inside of his armored helm. His suit hissed as it adjusted for pressure, warmth, and threat detection, but he didn't need technology to know what he was feeling. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity. The kind that rarely visited elite killers like him. Beneath the ice, half buried in ancient fractures of stone and bone, lay Earth's final frozen outpost, and around it, chaos. Not the kind that made for sport, but something more primal. More precise. He studied the site below through a narrow lens embedded in his gauntlet, zooming in on each of the bone spikes rising from the snow like territorial warnings. They weren't there before. No team had placed them. And the blood, it wasn't human. One of his own kind had died here, days before the scheduled hunt even began. He grunted through his respirator and said only 3 words to his squad. "We are challenged." The other hunters stood silently behind him, towering figures wrapped in matte black exo-armor with no visible faceplates, each a master in their own right. 7 in total, excluding Ronak. They weren't soldiers. They were ritual executioners, bred for silence, trained in planetary tracking, and genetically enhanced to feel more adrenaline when hunted than hunting. This place was meant to be a controlled test site, an artificial game field to rate how Earth's upper-tier soldiers performed under manipulated alien conditions. The humans were supposed to be unprepared, isolated, vulnerable. But now one of their own lay mutilated and displayed. Not taken in combat. There were no signs of struggle, no return blows, just execution, swift and humiliating. Ronak recognized the style. It was personal. He knelt beside the remnants of his fallen comrade, known as Drex. The body had been disassembled with surgical cruelty. The limbs had been rearranged into a sigil Ronak hadn't seen since the border wars of the Vargon Belt. It was a hunter's insult mark, one reserved for those who had turned on their own kind. This wasn't a declaration of war. This was revenge. The message wasn't for them. It was for him. Elsewhere, in the lower ravine, motion sensors flickered uselessly, struggling to identify heat. Shadows moved, but they blended into the snow, leaving the scanners blind. One hunter, a tracker named Salith, broke formation to pursue a faint reading, a flicker that lasted less than 2 seconds. She crept through the crevasse with dual blades drawn, her breath even, her mind blank of distraction. Her HUD adjusted for blur, for wind, even for thermal bleed from the rocks. Still nothing. She followed the trail anyway, silent, watching for even the subtlest break in snow pattern. She found it, half a boot print, not human, not alien, somewhere in between. As she knelt to scan it, the snow behind her shifted. Her blade whipped back instinctively, but it hit nothing. Still, she turned, senses on full alert. On the ridge above, 3 more hunters scanned the mountain pass, debating whether to activate full seek mode, an electromagnetic pulse that would shut down any stealth system within 2 miles. Ronak denied the request. "No toys," he said. "He doesn't use ours. We don't use his." It was a matter of pride. If their opponent hunted raw, they would match him on equal footing. One of the junior hunters, Urath, disagreed and triggered a drone anyway. It lasted 11 seconds before it crashed, sliced in half mid-flight. The last image it transmitted showed a shape in the storm, not quite a man, not quite a machine. Just a streak of motion, arms trailing something behind it, possibly fabric, or chains. General Riker watched it unfold from the Human Outpost's command center. They had access to partial feeds from the elite hunter's surveillance gear, which had been hacked and rechanneled to Earth's own satellites weeks before the mission began. What the aliens didn't know was that Riker hadn't just sent the Ridge team to monitor them, he'd sent them as bait. And when contact was lost, he knew exactly who to look for. He didn't say it out loud, but in his gut, he believed the impossible. Colonel Jace Corin had survived. Corin wasn't a name people said easily. A decorated war hero, a tactical ghost, and officially dead. But rumors never died, especially not the ones that claimed he was buried in Tunderax after detonating a cave to prevent alien retrieval squads from breaching Earth's old cryocache. The cave collapsed. The squad died. Corin was never found. What Riker suspected, but never dared confirm, was that Corin hadn't died under that ice. He had adapted. Miles away, under a veil of wind and snow, Corin moved like smoke through the canyon. His cloak, stitched from scavenged thermal hides and Zyrexian fireweave, rattled softly as he crouched beside another blood trail. He wasn't rushing. He had no backup. No orders. Just names. The symbols he left weren't random. They marked each hunter's original battlefield, where they'd committed atrocities during the outer planet culls. Corin had their dossiers, names buried deep in Earth's forbidden logs, long deleted from public record. These weren't just hunters. These were the ones who butchered his brother's unit, who broadcasted the executions across the off-world feeds. That recording had looped inside Corin's helmet for days after the mission went dark. He hadn't forgotten. Every blood spike he left in the ice was a response. A score. At twilight, the first trap was sprung. A hunter named Trilix ventured alone into the boreal caves, following what appeared to be a human thermal signal. What he found was a corpse. Not a soldier. A frozen clone of himself, armor modified to reflect his own weaknesses. He stepped closer, confused, and activated a buried seismic charge. The explosion wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It triggered a localized collapse of the cave system, swallowing him whole. Ronak's squad was down another elite. By the time night fell, only 5 remained. And now, even the bravest of them began to feel the silence differently. It wasn't the storm that threatened them anymore. It was the man who had lived beneath it. Corin watched from the cliffs, his breath steady, eyes unblinking beneath frostbitten lashes. He spoke only once to himself. 2 down. 5 left. 1 ridge. 1 reckoning. The ice would remember what fire had tried to bury. The wind howled through the cracks of the broken mining shaft like it had a soul. Corin crouched beside a collapsed support beam, hands bare against the ice, unmoving. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. There was a difference. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with frost, didn't blink as he watched the thermal trails on the cracked screen in front of him, an old Zyrexian scanner half repaired with human wiring and scraps. 3 signatures, closing in fast. 2 split off. 1 was cautious. 1 wasn't. Corin's lips twitched, not quite a smile. He reached behind him and unhooked a jagged blade wrapped in copper wire and something that used to be a spinal nerve from a Vargon beast. The blade hummed faintly, eager. The one who entered first was Urath, the impatient one. Young, by their standards, overconfident. His exosuit was newer, faster, but too loud in tight tunnels. His boots crunched softly through the half-collapsed shaft, scanning the walls for signs of movement. The signature he tracked was static, deliberately frozen in place to bait his path. He followed it perfectly. Corinne didn't move until the last second. The trap wasn't where the signal ended, it was where Urath would stop. And he did, right beside a hanging chain buried beneath rime ice. The chain snapped upward. Urath spun, weapon drawn. He didn't get to fire. Corinne dropped from above, blade first, carving through the shoulder seam of the hunter's armor, then vanished again into the side shaft without a word. The alien fell, not dead, but bleeding. And more importantly, afraid. He scrambled up and activated a proximity blast, vaporizing everything within 5 feet. It didn't hit anything. Corinne was already gone. His blood trail was invisible. There was none. It had stopped years ago. Whatever coursed through him now wasn't warm. Outside, the other 2 hunters picked up Uratha's biometrics and closed in. Ronak, watching from a hilltop with 3 others, narrowed his gaze as the signal blinked red. Another down. 4 left. But it wasn't the loss that disturbed him, it was the pattern. Every takedown had been executed with surgical intent, not rage. Not random. Whoever was behind this wasn't improvising. He was calculating. Ronak activated a silent protocol and rerouted his squad. Change the path. He's anticipating us. In the human command post, Riker watched the chaos unfold in broken feeds. He wasn't celebrating. He was troubled. The only reason their hacked satellite network still picked up partial hunter telemetry was because someone was feeding power back into the ridge's abandoned relay points. Someone down there was rerouting alien tech through Earth's old systems, blending code like he was born to do it. Only one man could do that without being detected. Riker zoomed in on the cave explosion data. There, barely visible, were fragments of the old Earth military patch, melted into the rocks. Corinne's mark. His tone darkened as he said, "He's not just fighting them. He's using them. Mapping them. Testing their fail-safes." Meanwhile, Corinne knelt beside the bleeding form of Urath, who was gasping through damaged filtration lines. The exosuit hissed in protest as its pressure core tried to reseal. Corinne didn't speak. He just opened a pouch, pulled out a cracked dog tag from his belt, and placed it beside Uratha's helmet. It wasn't a threat. It was a name. Urath recognized it. It was the name of the technician they had burned alive 5 years ago on the Vega extraction fields. That memory wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Yet here it was, returned in vengeance, carried by a ghost. Urath tried to activate his self-destruct. Corinne had already disabled it. He turned and walked away, leaving the alien alive, but branded. That was enough. The fear would do more damage than death. Back with the remaining 4, tension grew. They stopped speaking. Protocol dictated unity in the face of strategic threats, but Ronak ordered separate routes. The terrain favored asymmetry. They needed unpredictability. Still, it didn't help. The smallest of the group, a female unit called Vesa, was the first to sense it, a pattern in the kills, not just locations but the timing. Each takedown occurred at moments when squad focus fractured. When one argued. When another wandered too far. Corinne wasn't just fighting, he was reading their behavior like a playbook. She pulled back into a ledge and replayed her footage from before, slowing it frame by frame. There he was, a blur against the wind, pausing between footprints to avoid pressure-activated sensors. He wasn't guessing where they would be. He knew. She switched her comm to a private channel and whispered to Ronak. "This isn't warfare. It's revenge. He knows who we are. He's marking us." Ronak responded with silence at first, then asked, "What did you see?" Vesa hesitated, then said, "He bled once. Not a lot. But it wasn't red. It looked fused. Like machine oil and frost. He's not what he was. Vronak exhaled, not a sigh, more a warning breath to himself. Then he said, "No more pursuit. We hold the ridge. If he wants us, he'll come. Prepare the signal flare. It's time." Elsewhere, Corinne sat in a crevice of jagged stone, eyes closed. Around him, shattered remnants of alien scanners blinked uselessly, their power drained, their circuitry redirected. He'd scavenged them for weeks before this began. He knew their frequencies, their blind spots, even their delayed feedback loops. He wasn't just hunting these monsters. He was broadcasting every step to someone else, someone listening far above the clouds. Not Earth Command. Not Riker. Another watcher. He tapped a series of carved symbols into the wall with the butt of his blade. Names, dates, locations. Each was etched deep into the ice with steady hands. One line remained incomplete. Vronak. The last name. Not because he was the strongest, but because Corinne had saved him for last. As night fell again, and the frost thickened across the buried corpses of this so-called hunting game, the ridge whispered back to life. Not through sound. Through memory. Through ghost-coded tech, through blood-soaked symbols, through the shaking hands of those who thought they were predators and now realized they were prey. Corinne pulled his cloak over his shoulders, stood, and whispered into the wind. "One more night. Then I take their king." The ridge did not echo back. It didn't need to. It was already listening. Vronak stood motionless in the center of the ice clearing, his body still, but every sensor in his armor pulsing like a drumbeat against his skin. The cold didn't matter anymore. The storm had begun to die down, but the silence it left behind was heavier. Not the silence of peace, but of calculation. Every inch of terrain around him had become suspect. Each gust of wind carried a question: was this natural or design? He didn't need answers. He needed certainty. And the only certainty he had left was that the man hunting them wasn't playing for survival. He was playing for history. Vronak didn't respect many. He barely even acknowledged equals. But now, even as his muscles tensed for the next strike, he knew they were losing. Not because they were weaker. Because they were being outmaneuvered by something they didn't believe could exist. A ghost wearing vengeance like armor. Far below, inside an abandoned cavern once used for ore transport, Corinne scrawled another name into the wall. His hands bled slightly from the pressure, but he didn't seem to notice. Vesa. He had saved her for this chapter. Not because she was crueler than the others, but because she had hesitated. Back in the caves when she'd wounded him, there was a pause, half a second where her blade could have ended his pulse and didn't. That hesitation wasn't weakness. It was recognition. She had seen something in him that startled her. Maybe humanity. Maybe what was left of it. That single moment, brief as it was, had earned her a different fate. He would let her find the truth before she died. Vesa moved silently through the wreckage of an old satellite node buried in snow, rifle out, scanning patterns in the ground. She knew the others didn't understand it, but she did. The spacing between the attacks. The precision of the strikes. The layered traps that weren't just physical but psychological. Whoever he was, this wasn't his first cycle on the ice. He'd trained here. Lived here. Adapted here. More than that, he had made the ice part of him. She knelt near the base of a signal pole and saw something etched just beneath the snow, almost buried. It was a handprint. Human-sized. Burned into the surface like the snow had recoiled from it. She stared at it for a long moment before touching the edge, and when she did, her screen glitched. A shortwave message buzzed through her comms, but it wasn't military. It was pre-recorded audio, badly damaged, cutting in and out. One phrase repeated before the feed collapsed. "You remember Vega? You stood and watched." Her fingers froze above the console. That name wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The massacre at Vega Extraction Zone had been wiped from the archives. Burned from the military record books of multiple planets. She had been there, yes, but not involved. That's what she told herself. She had obeyed orders. She had done nothing. And that's exactly what this hunter remembered. Nothing. He was hunting those who had done everything, and those who had stood by and done nothing. It wasn't just about who had pulled the trigger. It was about who hadn't screamed. Her breathing quickened. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of being understood. Elsewhere, Corinne crouched on a cliff ledge scanning her movements. He didn't move to strike. Not yet. Vessa's calms were still active. She hadn't sealed her feed completely, and he had just enough of a line to intercept her heartbeat. It was faster than normal. Panicked. That was the break. Not fear. Guilt. He didn't hate her like the others. But he couldn't let her go. This wasn't about mercy. This was about the message. Each death had been symbolic. Not just for revenge, but for correction. The galaxy watched the strong. But they learned from the punished. If even one of the elite could be shaken, could break ranks, it would unravel the illusion of their superiority. Corinne descended the slope soundlessly, his cloak drawn around him, his pulse sinking with the snow patterns. He passed the dead ridge wolf along the way, bones picked clean, its fur stiff from blood. He paused, drew a mark on its forehead with ash from a flare stick, then moved on. The kill path was almost complete. Only 3 names remained. Vessa, Rivek, and Vronak. And the final one was personal. Rivek was already in motion, crossing the ice canyon with an overcharged seismic repeater. He didn't care about protocol anymore. He just wanted the target gone. A blunt solution to a precise problem. His suit carried the latest kinetic deflection armor, nearly impervious to blade strikes. He was built for forward charge and area collapse. And yet, even with all his gear, his breathing betrayed him. Sharp, shallow, impatient. His visor lit with location markers showing the last 3 conflict sites. He ignored them all. He thought Corinne would strike where he'd succeeded before. But Corinne didn't repeat. Not paths. Not methods. Not wounds. Rivek's boot hit something under the snow. A tiny vibration under the surface, just enough to make him pause. Before he could move, the ice beneath him shattered, not from an explosive, but from resonance. The entire plateau had been rigged to respond to sonic frequency. Corinne hadn't buried a charge. He had buried a tone. A sound Rivek's own suit emitted when scanning for motion. It was the armor itself that betrayed him. The ground gave way. Rivek fell into the crevice below, but the impact didn't kill him. The cold did. Seconds later, the wind swept across the ridge again, burying his scream before it ever reached the air. Back at the center of the ridge, Vronak stood over a beacon spike, holding something in his hand. It was a piece of Corinne's old unit badge, burned but intact. He had retrieved it from Drex's remains earlier and kept it, trying to understand the man behind the fury. Now, he wasn't sure there was a man left. Maybe just a will. A directive. A single, unstoppable cause carved from pain and sharpened by years of silence. He activated the emergency flare, a pulse beacon designed to call an external evac or backup from any nearby ship within 10 planetary clicks. Not because he needed help, but because he wanted witnesses. This wasn't just ending in shadows. It was going to be seen. He looked out across the ridge and shouted into the void. "I'm not hiding. Come. You want justice? Face me. Soldier to soldier." The wind didn't answer. But behind it, a shadow moved, slow and certain. Corinne heard the call. He stood up slowly from where he'd waited in the snow, his shoulders coated in frost, his face unreadable. He turned to face the central rise of the ridge, now lit by the beacon's glow. He whispered a name, not out of anger, but completion. The last game was about to begin. One hunter left. One final reckoning. The cloak shifted. The wind fell silent again. And Corinne began to walk. The storm broke for the first time in 7 days. Not fully, not enough for any satellite to get a perfect visual, but enough for moonlight to spill through the cracks in the swirling clouds and cast thin silver rays over the ice ridge. The flare Vronak had triggered still burned in the center of the battlefield, its pulse illuminating the jagged structures of frozen steel and ancient drilling towers long buried in permafrost. He stood alone, surrounded by silence, one hand gripping a two-handed battle staff embedded with energy spikes, the other resting against his thigh. His suit hummed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He wasn't tense, but every fiber of his mind was calculating. He had issued the challenge openly, expecting fury, expecting a roar from the shadows. But none came. The wind carried no reply. The silence was worse. It meant the man was already here. Corinne moved through the hollow wind tunnels without sound, the cloak trailing behind him like it belonged to the storm. His eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking, the frost curling around his lashes like spiderwebs. He didn't feel the cold anymore. The human part of him had surrendered that years ago. What remained was something stripped of comfort and born of intent. His body, half mended by alien components, pulsed faintly beneath the cloak with a strange glow, an after-effect of the Zyrexian power core that had been fused into his spine. It kept him alive. It fed his memory. It reminded him of every moment that brought him here. He reached the ridge's edge, peering down at Vronak, who stood as still as a statue. Corin said nothing. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, letting the snow crunch beneath his boot, the first sound either of them had heard in what felt like an eternity. Vronak turned toward it slowly, lifting his eyes to meet the figure emerging through the curtain of wind. The firelight behind him painted his outline in black and silver. The battle staff hummed louder. Vronak didn't posture. He just asked a single question. "How long have you been planning this?" Corin didn't answer right away. He stopped 5 feet from the alien and lowered his hood. His face was pale and frostbitten, one eye replaced by a faintly glowing lens that tracked Vronak's stance with surgical precision. When he spoke, his voice was calm, not broken, not ragged like a survivor's, but composed like a tactician reciting a chess move. "Since the first scream I didn't get to stop." Vronak nodded once. There was no mockery in him now. No arrogance. Just the understanding of what this moment was. 2 warriors, at the end of a blood trail, each with reasons deeper than protocol. He didn't wait for Corin to strike. He lunged first, closing the distance in a blur, the staff spinning. Corin sidestepped and twisted low, slamming his knee into the base of Vronak's spine, forcing a misstep. The alien responded with a reverse spin, catching Corin across the ribs. Sparks flew from the impact as armor met synthetic bone. They clashed in silence, with only the wind and the snapping ice between them. Each blow carried history. Vronak's was honed through decades of ritual hunts, taught by elders, polished through challenges across galaxies. Corin's was raw and jagged, built from trial, pain, and adaptation. He didn't follow form. He followed need. He turned Vronak's weight against him, using the curve of the ridge to redirect his footing, baiting him into overcommits, then punishing him with precision. The battle dragged toward the edge of the flare's light. Blood, both red and dark blue, stained the ice. Corin's left hand hung limp after a tendon snapped mid-block, but he didn't flinch. He adjusted. Switched grips. Pulled a serrated blade from his boot and drove it upward. Vronak caught it mid-strike, crushing the handle. Corin used the momentum to spin around and slammed the hilt into the base of his helmet, cracking the surface. Vronak backed away, chest heaving, now seeing something that unsettled him deeply. It wasn't the technique. It was the calm. Corin fought like a man who wasn't desperate to win. He fought like someone who had already buried the outcome and was merely fulfilling it. "You're not here for justice," Vronak growled through blood. "You're here for peace." Corin responded without hesitation. "Peace died when your kind taught us the difference between victory and survival." He lunged. Vronak blocked, but the attack was a feint. Corin dipped under, slammed a charged disc against the alien's hip joint, and kicked off him as it detonated. Vronak's left leg buckled. Corin landed hard, rolling back to his feet. Both were bleeding. Both were slowing. But one still carried names. One still had reason. Vronak stumbled and dropped to a knee. His visor flickered. Corin approached, dragging his cloak behind him like a funeral banner. He stopped inches from Vronak, stared down, and reached into his belt pouch. Slowly, he withdrew a single item, a steel plate etched with names. Names the elite hunters never thought anyone would remember. Names of soldiers, engineers, civilians. His brother. He dropped it on the ground. Vronak looked at it, then up at Corin. There was no plea in his eyes. Only finality. Will they remember this? He asked. Corin said. They already do. You just haven't felt it yet. With that, he drove the final blade, not through Vronak's chest, but into the comlink embedded behind his neck. A pulse shot into the sky, carrying the last data stream to the hunter's homeworld. Status eliminated. Reason failure. Message: Earth is not prey. Vronak fell, slumped against the flare, eyes dimming as the last of the light faded. Corin stood over him in the dark, the wind howling once more, the storm beginning to rise again. He didn't celebrate. He didn't collapse. He just stared at the beacon as it blinked once, then died. At the top of the ridge, General Riker watched the final pulse flicker out on the screen. The feed cut. No visuals. No signal. Just silence. He sat back, exhaled, and whispered to himself, "It's over." But far below, Corin didn't move. He stood alone on the ridge, surrounded by names carved into the ice, his breath slow and steady. The snow began to fall again, covering the tracks, the blood, the broken armor. Soon the ridge would look untouched. Silent. But the message would remain. Buried not just in code or record, but in legend. He turned without a word and walked into the snow, his cloak sweeping behind him, disappearing into the wind like he was never there. But the hunters would not return. Not now. Not ever. Because this place was no longer theirs. It belonged to the man who rode in Cloaked. The last name on every list. The ghost of the ridge. The reaper who came without sound and left with no glory. Only silence.